Hello, today I'm going to be discussing buying a bow for horseback archery. I'm going to be covering all the types of bow that are legal under the current rule sets, so there will be no Olympic recurves, compounds, anything with stabilisers, centre shot, that sort of thing included in this. I'm also not going to be recommending bows by any specific bowyers. This is going to be a discussion about general archetypes and their relevant strengths and weaknesses. It's worth noting that a very skilled bowyer will be able to make bows that reduce or even overcome some weaknesses in that specific design. The first question I'm always asked by beginners is about poundage. As a beginner, I recommend your first bow being low poundage, ideally sub 20, although this can be difficult to find. If assuming you are an adult, a hard limit of £30 for your first bow. In my opinion, the light bow is the most useful one you'd have in your collection and the one you would go back to most often for training purposes. As you develop as an archer, you're likely to want to have more than one bow available to you, so you'll end up wanting a second bow. The correct number of bows for an archer is always going to be n+1. For your second bow's poundage, I'd recommend going for a bow that is a poundage you can shoot without detrimental effect on your shooting over the duration of an average shooting session. So for example, in my personal sessions, I shoot between 50 and 100 arrows, so if I'm fatiguing before that, the bow is too heavy. This bow will be the one you use to compete with and do the majority of your day-to-day training with. This is also where I'd recommend spending the most money, as your competition bow will get the most out of being better made. I'd recommend looking for a second bow after around a year of regular shooting, once you have a consistent style and correct muscle usage. Finally, if you're looking to build up to higher poundages or start looking towards historical archery and the weights they used to use, you'll want to consider a third bow. This bow's primary purpose is for weight training, so you should be able to shoot 3 to 12 arrows before fatiguing. I do not recommend this until you're very comfortable in your shooting style and have a few years' experience under your belt. I would also recommend pairing this with strength and conditioning training in a gym. Now onto the shape of bow to look for. I'm going to divide this into 6 categories. These are going to be long bows, Japanese yumis, short draw bows, working recurves, static non-contact recurves, and static contact recurves. Up first we have long bows. This is not just the English longbow but applies to any long straight bow, including English longbow, European longbow and American flat bows. These bows are generally coming in at over 70 inch. They are very unwieldy from horseback. From the perspective of a horse archer, longbows are very impractical, and while it's definitely possible to use them, there's a reason horse archery shows up a lot less in cultures using long symmetrical bows. Longbow on horseback is really only for enthusiasts and requires a lot of skill in both riding and archery to be performed, and it has a general disadvantage in all current forms of competition. Next we have the Japanese yumi. These are large asymmetric bows shot with a very unique technique, which requires a great deal of specialist training to learn. I'm still very much a novice myself. Due to their shape, they can also only be shot right-handed. 2 variations exist, the great bow or daikyu and the half bow or hankyu. Apologies if I messed the pronunciation up. Both are quite long, but due to the asymmetric shape, the reduced length of the bottom limb goes a long way to reduce how unwieldy they are when compared to bows of similar length. Due to the way the bow behaves, I would recommend using a more experienced horse. It can be very easy to catch them with the bow at release. As for their usefulness in competition, the 3 major rule sets in Europe, that's WAF, the IHAA and Kashai, all place the Yumi at a disadvantage. I consider the Yumi to be an incredible bow to learn to shoot that will challenge your ideas about archery, but the challenge and the time investment makes this a hard setup to recommend. Jumping to the other end of the spectrum, we have short draw bows, sometimes referred to as primitive bows. Usually under 45 inches in length and crucially have a max draw length of under 26 inch. It is generally uncommon to see these types of bows used in sport archery, but there is a growing movement, primarily based in the US, which is putting more information out about these bows and how they're shot. Historically, the use of these bows on horseback is tied primarily with the Comanche, which unfortunately means we have very limited information on how they were shot. As for competitions, these are largely untested in any of the rule sets I'm familiar with. These bows do offer unparalleled mobility due to their short length, but come with two major drawbacks, if you'll pardon the pun. First, the short max draw means reduced power stroke on the arrow, which reduces the effective range of these bows. And secondly, whilst it's entirely possible to shoot a short draw with good biomechanics, the short draw length doesn't encourage it in the same way as a longer draw does, potentially increasing the risk of injury in less experienced archers. Because of this, I would only recommend these bows and this style of shooting to experienced archers interested in doing some of the practical research themselves. With that out of the way, I've covered what I consider to be the more specialist bows, so the next three we'll be looking at are the most common types of bow you'll see in the average competition. Working recurves are defined as recurved bow where the limb tips unfold. The most common example is the Korean style bows such as the Kaya or the SKB. As a general rule, these bows tend to be around 50 inches in length and possess large transformation distance, meaning they become substantially shorter when at full draw. This helps improve the stability, meaning these bows can have incredibly low physical mass. From a purely performance perspective, at the lower poundages the working recurve is unmatched, offering on average the best energy transfer. Like all things, they do come with a few issues that should be considered. First, the short length combined with the transformation distance makes a very acute string angle, meaning that techniques that require multiple digits on the string can become challenging and uncomfortable. Secondly, these bows can be prone to twisting if not cared for, and can unstring themselves if shot poorly. On a usual competition field, many of the newer, less experienced archers will be using them, but more senior athletes will often be using these as well as well-made static recurves. Static recurves are often considered the opposite of the working recurve. This means the limb tips, or in the case of static recurves, sires, do not bend. The defining feature is the large pieces of solid wood at either end of the bow. Higher quality bows tend to have smaller sires, as this reduces the physical mass of the bow. The static recurve will generally have a higher limb mass than a working recurve, meaning a greater force is required to overcome the mass, meaning at a low poundage some of the energy is often lost through the limbs. However, at a high enough poundage and a heavy enough arrow, it's able to possess more momentum than a working recurve. A non-contact static recurve is a static recurve bow design where the string does not touch the sire at its base. This allows for reduced noise compared to contact recurves, and as such can be more useful when training newer or more nervous horses. A contact static recurve has a point of contact at the base of the sire and the string. This makes the moment the arrow detaches sharper, meaning less energy is left in the string. When viewed in slow motion, this can be seen as the string continuing to pass beyond the bow's brace height. This effect leads to a faster flying arrow, but also results in a louder shot, meaning some young or more inexperienced horses may struggle with the noise of these bows. Finally, I will summarise and offer some recommendations. The longbow, Yumi and short draw bows all require an enthusiast mentality, and I would generally only suggest to people with a special interest in them and extensive experience. The contact recurve I would steer anyone training a new horse away from due to the noise, but I will highly recommend them for anyone looking to upgrade their current bow setup. This leaves us with working recurves and non-contact statics. And honestly, there is no right answer. Statics recurves will feel steady in the hand, whereas a working recurve will give slightly better performance at the lower poundages for a beginner. As I stated above, I cannot stress the importance enough of having a light poundage bow to begin with. This will ensure you develop good technique and will be the bow you come back to after breaks, injuries, or when you just want to try out a new technique. I also highly recommend learning on a bow with a high max draw length, ideally 32 inches or more, as this will help encourage good biomechanics. If you're planning to shoot from horseback, I'd suggest being cautious of bows that are particularly long, 56 inches or more, as these can be quite cumbersome to ride with. And while as a slim-built man I'm definitely not qualified to talk about this, if you are larger chested, longer bows run the risk of becoming quite painful and causing injury if you make a mistake, particularly when learning front shots, so I definitely avoid these when starting out. the end of the day, the absolute best piece of bow buying advice I can give you is to get a bow you like. It looks pretty is a perfectly valid reason to buy a bow, and you're far more likely to shoot a bow you like.